Hi everyone, I'm Laura McKenzie. Thank you very much for joining us on this Inside the Archives session in the Barker Research Library. Today we're going to be looking at a couple of authors that I discovered during a recent project that I did in partnership with New Writing North and Durham University. That project was called Writing Durham, and the aim of it was to investigate writers that were either from Durham or had written about Durham or had some kind of significant attachment to Durham, and then make a case from there for Durham's literary significance. And the range of writers I discovered was incredibly broad, but I was particularly drawn to these two guys. So today we're going to be looking at Lafcadio Hearn and Hugh Walpole, two very different writers. They're not from Durham, but they were both educated here. Hearn attended St Cuthbert's at Ushaw College, and Walpole was educated at Durham School. And what binds them together is that they didn't have a particularly good time here, and in fact their years at Durham left them with quite significant emotional, psychological, and in the case of Hearn, physical scars that they then spent the rest of their writing career kind of negotiating. So they played quite a pivotal role in shaping both their writing and their identities. And what's particularly interesting for me is that these two writers, again, very different in terms of where they ended up and the sort of writing that they engaged with in a broad spectrum, but they both have this quite persistent focus throughout their writing on issues of the Gothic and the macabre. And for me, for writers who grew up in the shadow of the cathedral, didn't have a particularly great time here at school, quite certainly by today, relatively punitive ecclesiastical schooling, that they keep coming back to these issues of the Gothic and the macabre. So we're going to be looking at some of those texts in particular and other kind of contextual things that I found here in the archives and the special collections at the Palace Green Library. So we're going to start with Lafcadio Hearn. I'm going to use this. This is his Japanese letters. I'll tell you a bit about him as I'm finding the page. So incredibly interesting life even before he ended up in Durham. So he was born in Lafcadio, probably haven't pronounced that right, but it's one of the Greek islands. And he then moved to Dublin, and then his parents, by all intents and purposes, abandoned him, left him with an aunt that he didn't particularly get on with, and she shipped him over here to Durham to attend Ushaw College. So I've opened it up here because we've got a nice picture of him just down here in the corner. That's Lafcadio. He was always photographed in his adult and adolescent life from this side. And this is because when he was at Ushaw, they have a game there, or they used to back in the day. I assume it doesn't happen now. At Ushaw, there was a game specific to the college called Giant Stride, which involved a piece of rope which was knotted at the end. So already that sounds like a great idea. But he was injured during one of these games, and it knocked out, or didn't knock out, but really damaged his left eye. Scar tissue grew over it. He thought it made him look repulsive, and he writes to his sister that he hopes her children never see it from that side because they'll be terrified of him. And you can see here he's only ever photographed here on the right side. This is his good side. So this is him at 16, and you think you can kind of see here that scar tissue. This must have been just after it happened. He joined Ushaw when he was 13, and the accident happened when he was 16. But this, along with his schooling there, and he talks about it as being a place that was relatively harsh, but it did give him a lot of space in that, I don't know if anyone's been to Ushaw College, but it's quite far out of the city. The grounds are amazing. It gave him a lot of space to physically get out and develop as an individual. But he was taught by priests, and he really developed this quite severe distaste for the Catholic faith. And again, that's shaped his writing. He went to Ushaw. He then moved to Cincinnati, tentatively because he had a familial connection there, and became a slaughterhouse journalist. So he was on the murder beat, but he was a kind of a hack, and he became known for attending the grisliest murder scenes and getting right up close to the bodies. And I think he had quite a reputation for being quite unshakable and involved in the grisly. So in 1890, Hearn was employed by the magazine Harper's Weekly to be their correspondent in Japan. So he travelled over. He lasted about a week before he quit Harper's and found work as an English teacher. and eventually he gave up his passport, became a Japanese citizen, married the daughter of a retired samurai, and spent the rest of his life being kind of a Western interpreter of Japan. So he wrote books on Japanese culture, and he also published some very popular English translations of Japanese folk tales. So we can look at one of those now, or several of those now. And they're absolutely beautiful books. Here we go. So I've been talking to Danielle here, one of the staff at the Barker Research Library, and we are fairly convinced that this paper is bamboo. But I wish I could, it feels kind of, I can't describe what it feels like, but it doesn't feel like paper. It feels like a woven material. We've got these beautiful silk threads here, stab stitched. So this is Japanese Fairy Tales, series number 23, and the title story is The Boy Who Drew Cats. And what's interesting about this story for me, although it's a known Japanese fairy tale, there are some kind of correlations between Lafcadio's experience at Ushore and the character of the story. So it's about a little boy who gets sent away to get trained at a temple, trained to be a priest, but he spends too much time drawing cats. He's too involved in his own kind of artistic thing that he's doing. He doesn't spend enough time concentrating on lessons. It's exactly what happened to Lafcadio. He was too interested in writing poetry and actually following the lessons at Ushore, and he was penalised for it. And these cats in the story, they become something quite dangerous, and he is sent away from the school and warned never to draw them in a large place, only small. And he spends the night at a ruined temple, draws his cats, and the cats come alive in the night and actually kill a goblin. And we've got a goblin rat, and we've got a lovely picture here of the dead rat. So there he is drawing his cats, nice and gory. But this idea that art can be something dangerous, but is also something that's quite efficacious in countering evil, is something that for me really aligns with Hearn and what we know about him and his identity and his career, and something that Hearn really took away from him from Durham and kind of pervades his writing is this distaste of Catholicism. And for me, it could be that this rat kind of symbolises this, and his art, the boy's art, is countering it, just as Hearn sought to counter this kind of ecclesiastical, overarching, punitive notion of Catholicism that he'd been raised with at the college. We can see this in another book, or a short story in a book. So this is the collection Shadowings, published in 1901. So you can see here it says Lafcadio Hearn, lecturer on English literature in the Imperial University, Tokyo, Japan. Gothic horror seems to be talking about a structure that is either very similar to or is Durham Cathedral, and it relates the psychological dread inspired by the oppression of Catholicism to this space, this Gothic space that's very similar to me for the 9 altars, the Chapel of the 9 Altars in Durham Cathedral. So I'm going to read you a small part here. One writer's confession that the interior of a Gothic church seen at night gave him the idea of being inside the skeleton of some monstrous animal, and by a far-famed comparison of the windows of a cathedral to eyes and of the door to a great mouth devouring the people. So this section in particular reminds me of the Chapel of the 9 Altars. To any experienced eye, the curves of Gothic arching offer a striking resemblance to certain curves of vegetal growth, the curves of a palm branch being perhaps especially suggestive, but observe that the architectural form suggests more than any vegetal comparison could illustrate. The meeting of the 2 palm crests would indeed form a kind of Gothic arch, yet the effect of so short an arch would be insignificant. For nature to repeat the strange impression of the real Gothic arch, it was necessary that the branches of the touching crests should vastly exceed, both in length of curve and strength of spring, anything of their kind existing in the vegetable world. The lines of the tall medieval arch seem to express a crescent force immensely surpassing that of nature, and the horror of Gothic architecture is not in the mere suggestion of a growing life, but in the suggestion of an energy supernatural and tremendous. Of course, the child, oppressed by the strangeness of Gothic forms, is yet incapable of analysing the impressions received. He is frightened without comprehending. He cannot divine that the points and the curves are terrible to him because they represent the prodigious exaggeration of a real law of vegetal growth. He dreads the shapes because they seem alive, yet he does not know how to express this dread. Without suspecting why, he feels that this silent manifestation of power, everywhere pointing and piercing upward, is not natural. And that is very much how Hearn felt about the Catholic faith. Hugh Walpole, slightly different writer, well, a very different writer. So this is Hugh Walpole, photographed in his home at 90 Piccadilly. Walpole was born in 1884. He, again, lived in various places before he ended up in Durham when his father, Seymour Walpole, was appointed head of Bede College, which at the time was dedicated to teacher training. And he attended Durham School as a day boy, which is crucial because day boys at Durham School were horrendously bullied by the boarders, and he had an absolutely terrible time here. And also his family was kind of shunned by the snobbish cathedral set because Bede College wasn't a significant part of the university at that time. So his family was looked down on by the elite of Durham, and he was looked down on and bullied by the other boys at his school. And he talks about this in great depth throughout his work. We've got one instance here. This is The Apple Trees, which is a collection of autobiographical reminiscences dedicated to Henry James, with love. Walpole was he's an overlooked writer of the earlier 20th century. He was very prolific. He wrote many, many novels. He was a critic who was very widely known, widely read by the general public, very in with that set, with Henry James. He was a good friend of Virginia Woolf's, but he was largely derided by critics. So he didn't achieve critical acclaim, and his work has kind of faded into obscurity. But he was quite a significant player in the literary set at that time. So he talks in this story, The Entangled Garden. Well, it's not a story, it's a reminiscence about the apple garden that was attached to the house at Bede College where him and his family lived. And he always had a sense of this apple garden, which looked out onto the peninsula and the river and the cathedral, as being a very threatening, overwhelming place. And for me, when I read it, it's kind of an outward manifestation of how he's feeling inside. So he's talking about reading Virginia Woolf and there being mention of apple trees. So he talks here about this apple garden as quite a threatening space. So he's been inspired by this episode in Woolf where she's talking about apple trees. And he writes, "When I read these lines, I was swung back absolutely into the centre of that evilly enchanted scene, the tangled, untended orchard that ran down to the mysterious river, the echo across the fields of the cathedral bells, the dry, knotted hands of old Wallace, the gardener, the inescapable loneliness, as though one were caught into a cruel net flung over one by a malicious power, the long dusty classroom with the rows of bound graphics, the clocks at the stairhead that grunted like an ancient asthmatic man, the figures seen like men in dream of Mr. Reed and Mr. Harvey and Mr. Dall, my parents kind and watchful and infinitely remote, my brother and sister, and, most sinister of all, like a prison wall with immutable, confining strength, the school beyond the fields and the town, over all these things, the gnarled and sterile apple trees." So it's this very threatening space. Durham has become this kind of monster lurking over this garden of apple trees. There were 5 of us, my father, my mother, my sister and brother. My sister and brother were younger than I. I went every day to Durham School, and some of my unhappiness came from the snobbish dislike of being a day boy. My father's college was not considered by the dignitaries of the cathedral and the professors of the university a very handsome affair, We were a little outside things socially, and some of my unhappiness came from that snobbery also. I was a complete failure at school in every possible way. And he goes on to speak in these very self-deprecating terms about himself. Part of that comes from the fact that there is such a lot of self-pity in what he's saying about himself, but he's very aware of that as well. Like, he talks about his schoolboy self as being odious and a terrible bore, and he can completely understand why no one didn't like him. So he speaks about himself in very derogatory terms, and he's very aware that he perhaps might have been quite a petulant and frustrating child. And despite this, he's very warm and engaging, and I think actually draws you into his writing rather than pushes you away. So we have here an example of when he talks about himself in these derogatory terms. He's talking about his teacher, McKenzie. He would have done something for me if he could, but I was everything that he most disliked, and I was a day boy, which meant that he saw me only at the bottom of his class or slinking furtively home when the moment of happy escape had arrived. Now, he completely understands this dislike in his writing. He speaks elsewhere that he grew up through those 7 years discontented, ugly, abnormally sensitive, and excessively conceited. No one liked me, not masters, boys, friends of the family, nor relations who came to stay, and I do not in the least wonder at it. So this identity of self-pity and self-distaste is something that recurs in his books about the macabre, of which there are a few, and I have one here, which is Portrait of a Man with Red Hair, which was published in 1925. So the Portrait of a Man with Red Hair is quite an odd little book. It's certainly very unsettling. I'm not going to give away the ending, so no spoilers, because I think everyone should go away and read it. But the man with the red hair is a guy called Crispin, who turns out to be a sadistic lunatic, which the protagonist, Harkness, gets embroiled with on an escapade. And Harkness, very early on in the book, describes him in terms familiar to us from Walpole's description of himself as a child. So he says, "That is why I am always creeping away from things. Why, too, I never make friends, not real friends. Why, at 35, I am a complete failure. That is, from the point of view of anything real. I am filled, too, with self-pity," he added, as he opened to Paradise again and groped for page 4. "And self-pity is the most despicable of all the vices." So he sees terribly hard on himself. I see Walpole in this quite significantly. So the book, just thinking about Walpole and Hearn together, again, no spoilers, the antagonist is an awful piece of work, and there's certainly something of the school bully in him. So I'll just move briefly back now to Rupert Hart-Davis's biography on Walpole, where he talks about Portrait of a Man with Red Hair. So Vance, who was the publisher of Portrait of a Man with Red Hair, or the potential publisher, should I say, when confronted with the final manuscript, was horrified by it. He described it as distinctly gruesome and unpleasant. He had not bargained for the sadistic queerness of the story. This is important because Walpole was part of that famously gay but still closeted group of writers, Henry James, etc., who he had a close friendship with during the early half of the 20th century, that literary group. So this queerness is quite significant. Queerness of the story. He was certain it would deeply shock his large female public, and he accordingly repudiated the book entirely. So I think Walpole ended up printing it privately. But again, this stems from, I think, his school days, certainly at Durham and the schools he attended beforehand. He doesn't talk about it directly, but he was exposed to some fairly traumatic events. If we go to the Portrait of the Man with Red Hair, so this is when Harkness is in a car with the baddie, Crispin, sitting next to him. He was so close to Crispin, and his leg was pushed so firmly against Crispin's leg that this movement might have been accidental had Crispin's whole hand rested there. But there was only the finger, and soon it began its movement, staying for an instant, pressing through the cloth onto the bone of the knee, then moving very slowly up to the thigh, the sharp fingernail suddenly pushing more firmly into the flesh, then the finger relaxing again and making only a faint, tickling, creeping suggestion of pressure. Halfway up the thigh it stopped. For an instant the whole hand, soft, warm and boneless, rested on the stuff of Harkness's trousers, then withdrew, and the fingers, like a cautious animal, moved on. So this is a moment when Harkness is kind of trapped in this car with Crispin pressed up against him, and this very threatening sexual episode occurs, and he feels completely trapped and can't escape. And that, to me, is certainly something that I think drew from Walpole's school days. And it could have been from the school beforehand, but we know he had a pretty rubbish time at Durham. So all these experiences then feed into the writing and kind of negotiating what's happening with those past traumas. There was one place, however, where Walpole did feel happy in Durham, and this was at the time famous bookshop called the House of Andrews, which was on Sadler Street. And he used to go in there after school as a refuge and just basically used it as his own personal lending library. He was one of those people who just takes the books off the shelf and flicks through them and then puts them back, except he didn't flick through them. He actually just stood there and read the whole thing and then returned them. And in this copy of Roman Fountain, the book's actually about a visit to Rome on the death of Pope Pius XI, I think it was. But also involves various reminiscences. But on the back here we have, don't know whether you can see here, the House of Andrews, Durham, for over 125 years, noted for books, stationery, fancy and leather goods. So that's the bookseller's stamp, I suppose you could say. And then we have taped in the back a letter to, I assume, a local paper, by one Warneford Smart, who was the proprietor of the House of Andrews, which reads, "Following the article in the Newcastle Journal on Mr. Rupert Hart Davis's biography, I think it may be of interest to record that Sir Hugh Walpole, as a pupil of Durham School, spent most of his free time during our business hours in the House of Andrews, reading through book after book which he had left specially placed ready to pick up again and continue reading at such times as it suited him. There was a ladder which he moved about and against which he leaned when he read, his foot resting on a low step, comfortably enjoying himself and always absorbed in the book, and yet with never a pleasing expression. He just took it as a matter of course, as if it were a public library, and it was here that he read through standard English fiction, Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, etc. I tolerated it because I much liked his father, who was a charming man, so different from his son, who never showed the least appreciation of the kindness I allowed myself to extend to him." And it says in the end, "I came into contact with the staff of the College of Venerable Bede, and all concerned, Hugh seemed to be a thorn in the flesh to all." So it seems that Hugh's self-deprecating view of himself as odious when he was younger was well earned, but I love him nonetheless. So I hope you enjoyed this session. All these books and more are in the Barker Research Library. It's open to the public, so if you'd like to learn more about Hearn or Walpole or any other fascinating writers that are connected with Durham, then please come down to the Barker Research Library and have a look for yourself. Thank you very much.